Hello, this is Father Rich. I'm coming to you from the main entrance hallway to the rectory on the first floor. Right behind you are the main doors of the rectory. They're the third set of doors along the northern front of the church, then the offices, rectory. I'm guessing not many of you have come through those rectory doors, but it would lead right into this hallway, the stairway upstairs, my office over here, and the living or the dining room to your left. But we'll come back to this spot in a moment. Today's essay on our How the Church Has Changed the World series is entitled, Here is Truth. And so it is about a woman who was a philosopher and a well-educated woman of Poland in the early 1900s, who in the midst of her studies and teaching had Jewish roots. But in the midst of this, she came across a book that she read. And amidst all her studies and learning for truth, she would say, and when she finished reading this book, here is truth. And it was the book on the life of St. Theresa of Avila. This would be a major moment of conversion for Edith Stein. She would become Catholic and eventually become a Carmelite nun, following in the life of St. Theresa of Avila, who reformed the Carmelites 350 years before Edith. And she'd eventually, with her sister, be taken into the concentration camps of Poland. And she would die in Auschwitz because of being a Catholic and a nun. And now she's known as St. Theresa Benedicta of the Cross. And so this essay starts by talking about the treasures of the church. And one of those treasures they focus on today in this essay is St. Theresa of Avila. Not only a saint, not only did she reform the Carmelites in the 1500s, but she's now considered a doctor of the church. One of 4 women given that designation. We have 6 doctors now in the church, given that designation because they have contributed significantly to the understanding of our faith and kind of the theological development of our faith. She wasn't so much theological, but in her spiritual, mystical writing and experience of prayer and God in prayer, she is considered a doctor. And one of the books that she's most well known for, classic in spirituality, is called The Interior Castle. So I had the castle here. This is a 3D puzzle of Camelot. But she at one point was wanting to have an insight into what the soul looked like, in the soul in grace. And so she saw this crystal structure, which she'd eventually call this castle. And that was how she would describe the levels of the interior life. This castle was 7 levels. And it's really amazing, but very challenging reading. She also wrote The Way of Perfection, amongst other writings. And so the essay goes through and really kind of parallels how the world sees things. And this is something we see in the wisdom literature in the Bible, and Jesus certainly reinforcing that it's more important to have wisdom in the ways of God and as opposed to the ways of the world. And that this was a wisdom that St. Theresa of Avila was greatly blessed with. So the essay goes through and saying like what the world says and how St. Theresa would respond. So the first thing he says, believe in yourself, says the world. And he goes on to say how in excess of that belief in self, and a man elevating themselves, one of the examples he gives is Joseph Stalin, who gave himself the name Stalin, meaning steel, to kind of show what he can do as a human being. St. Theresa says humility. Her quote, humility must always be doing its work like a bee making honey in the hive. Without humility, all will be lost in the soul. So, and then another, avoid suffering and do as you please, says the world. And we know that that's a constant challenge, especially in our day and age, as we're able to avoid more suffering with the ways the technology and medicine has advanced. But Theresa, who they call a fool for God, urges her sister otherwise. Embrace the cross which your spouse bore upon your shoulders, she says, and realize that this cross is yours to carry too. And then she goes on, let her who is capable of the greatest suffering suffer most for him, and she will have the most perfect freedom. So she clearly saw the connection between the suffering of the cross and that leading to freedom in one's soul. She addresses a lot of this to the women because she was writing to her daughters in the Carmelite order. Seek your own consolation, says the world. Theresa says, perfection consists not in consolations, but in the increase of love. So not seeking, these exterior consolations that we can't control, but our will, our choice to love other. Follow your heart, says the world. And again, some of these things can be healthy if seen in the right context. But if it's all about me and just following my heart, who are we turning out? We're not seeking God's will. And so she would say, and then saying that heart can tangle itself more in cravings and confusions, growing year by year, a tough rind of insensibility. That you try to follow your heart. How can we follow our hearts when we're all over the place in our humanity? She would say, pray that the God will enlarge your heart, St. Theresa says. The world, old and dense, tells us to reason everything out before we have faith. But Theresa says that our understanding will be most wakeful when we put a stop to all discursive reason and rest content to be in the presence of him who is love and who we love. So again, profound wisdom. Love, says the world, of divorce, abandonment, dismissal, and indifference. A world hard of hearing and harder of heart. He has a great way of putting things, the writer. The world is pleased to consider that God, whose love will be as indifferent to sin as it is. The world longs for immortality so that it may sin and sin forever. But Theresa begs us so to unite ourselves with God in prayer that the thorn of sin will pierce us as they pierce Christ. He goes on, knowledge is one thing, a matter for the scientists, says the world, and love is another. They separate these things. But St. Theresa would put it in the context of, she says, we long to know God, the fountainhead, the infinite sea of the personal. And she would say that it's like a spiritual marriage, the love between soul and God. And that image is what we will experience not only here on earth, and she did in ecstatic ways and in mystic ways, but it's also the image of what we'll experience forever. Whereas the world says, when we die, we will return to dust, the cosmic dust, right? So she says that spiritual union, that spiritual marriage with God and the soul, there is in one sense no more I and thou, but only God. There is a self-forgetfulness, which is so complete that it really seems as though the soul no longer existed. So these were not only things she could just speak about, but she experienced, really giving us a window into the intimate, contemplative, unitive life with our God, which we should all be seeking, even here on earth, but it's what we're created for forever in heaven. So I hope we can appreciate the treasure that St. Theresa of Avila is. As we mentioned, she lived in the 1500s, and she was part of what we call now the Counter-Reformation, the Catholic Counter-Reformation to the Protestant Reformation, a way that the Spirit of God brought new life to the church through these great saints that reformed the Carmelites, the St. Ignatius of Loyola, who started the Jesuits, St. Robert Bellarmine, who was a great Jesuit and a learner, St. Charles Borromeo, a great bishop in Milan, and really gave the church getting its feet back on the ground, being renewed in that century, and really once again changing the world and seeing that the church needed to be renewed. And that we have to constantly do that in our own lives, in our own parishes, certainly in the Church Universal. So we're so grateful for this treasure of St. Theresa of Avila and the way she helped bring renewal to the church, and that church then helped change the world. And what a gift that is. So thanks for joining me today. Have a great day, and God bless.